And sometimes that's a hard sell because the clients think, well, if it's working, why am I going to change? The Lyme vaccine in general is started in puppies if they have a risk of exposure after their initial distemper and rabies. And then it's given as 2 injections 3 weeks apart. It's then given as an annual vaccine. Leptospirosis is our last disease, guys. You almost made it. It is an infection caused by a spiral-shaped bacteria. It's also known as a spirochete called Leptospira. And this bacteria can be found free-living and survive on its own in fresh water, soil, mud. It can also be found within different animal hosts. There's over 150 mammalian species that have been infected with leptospirosis, and this includes cats, dogs, and people. And there's over 250 known potentially infectious forms, we call them serovars, of leptospires. And there are 10 important serovars that infect pets. And pets can come in contact with the bacteria through direct contact with infected tissues or secretions, especially urine. It can also come in contact with contaminated water, soil, or food. Urine-contaminated water is probably the most common way that mammals contract leptospirosis. And there's 2 phases associated with leptospirosis. There's the acute and the chronic phase. And the signs seen in the acute infection include nothing, to vomiting, diarrhea, reduced appetite, muscle pain, fever, lethargy, depression. And then you can also see acute kidney injury or liver injury. And then signs seen with the chronic infection can include things like increased thirst, kidney disease, or failure, liver disease or failure, inflammation of the eyes called uveitis. You can get muscle pain, fever, lethargy, depression, and even potentially death. And the big thing about leptospirosis is it's zoonotic, so we can get it. And people can come into contact with the bacteria in the environment, but they can also come in contact with the bacteria from your pet's urine. So dogs with an increased risk of exposure to wildlife that shed the bacteria should definitely be considered candidates for getting the vaccine. And I used to practice in Chicagoland, which is like this name they call the suburbs surrounding Chicago, as well as in Chicago proper. And we had a lot of lepto, and there's a lot of rats in Chicago, and thus a lot of lepto. But we do still see leptospirosis in Northern Virginia as well. And to be honest, I have a love-hate relationship with the vaccine. In theory, I think it's great to prevent this potentially fatal bacterial infection. But here's the rub. Most vaccines out there only protect against 4 of the 10 common strains of leptospirosis. And that's Canicola, Grippotyphosis, Icterohemorrhagiae, and Pomona. And there's no cross-protectivity. So that means if the vaccine protects against those 4, but your pet is exposed to something different, such as there's an autumnalis serovar of leptospirosis, they would still get infection, and they could still get really sick. So while it's effective against those strains, it's not effective against everything. And that's kind of frustrating. The leptospirosis vaccine that we use is the Mariel Recombitek 4, which carries those 4 strains. It's non-adjuvanted, and it's labeled to prevent the developing of disease and the shedding of disease in the instances of Canicola, Grippotyphosis, and Icterohemorrhagiae. But it only aids in the prevention of shedding and disease for Pomona. So that means that if you're exposed to Pomona, your pet could still get sick and still potentially give it to you. Granted, some have the theory of something's better than nothing, but I just struggle with the idea of how necessary is it. Basically, I had this conversation with all of my clients, and we decide, is it best for your pet to receive the vaccine or not receive the vaccine? And if their pet has chronic illness, then we really need to weigh the pros and cons. If their pet is a young, healthy dog, or if they have a hunting dog, or they're going to go hiking all the time, or they live in a heavily wooded area, or they live in an area with rats or mice, then you should consider it. My other issue with the lepto vaccine is that veterinarians and people often forget that animals can still get the infection even if they're vaccinated. Sometimes we lose sight of this concept, especially if patients have symptoms that are similar to those of leptospirosis, but they've already been vaccinated. So we think, no, they can't possibly have it, but they still could. I personally do not vaccinate my dog against leptospirosis. I used to, and then I decided not to. But I think that if I had a high risk of exposure, if I had a young dog, especially if I had a hunting dog, I would definitely consider it. It's just, you got to go in it with both eyes open. You have to understand, unfortunately, it's not the end-all be-all of lepto vaccines. And eventually we will likely have vaccines that protect against more serovars, but just right now we don't. And you made it. that concludes our trilogy about vaccines. And unfortunately, there's no surprise endings like you sometimes have in trilogies. It's just the end. I think that about wraps it up. As always, thank you for listening to this installment of Vetsplaining. I hope you enjoyed your time with me and ideally learned at least one new thing for the day. If you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, feel free to leave a comment below or email info@independenthillvet.com and put podcast topic or podcast comment in the subject line. Until next time.